In this part, I'd like to show you how I laminated the deck, created structural and visible fillets in the cockpit, attached stringers to the cockpit floor, and routed the recess for the centerboard. Hello and welcome to this video in which I would like to show you how I installed the final structural reinforcements and components. Before the deck could be covered with fiberglass mats on the top side, the joints between the front panels and some smaller holes had to be filled. To do this, I used epoxy thickened with cotton fibers, microspheres and color pigments. I squeezed it out of a plastic bag and smoothed it with a spatula. Once everything was dry and sanded, I was able to apply fiberglass mats to the deck. I did this step in the morning when the temperature was rising. Since the forward section of the boat is completely enclosed, pressure built up there, causing larger air bubbles on the deck. But at that time there was nothing I could do about it. Once everything was dry, I was able to cut out the openings for the inspection hatches in that area. As mentioned in the last video, I marked the longitudinal center positions of the hatches onto the outwales, so I just needed to connect them with a straight line. To find the correct distance, I put a laser on the foredeck and measured the distance from the center line. With the counterpart of the hatches, I was able to draw a circle and cut it out with a jigsaw. I then sanded out the air bubbles, cleaned everything, and covered them with fiberglass patches. Afterwards, I sanded everything flush. Next, I was able to create the remaining fillets in the cockpit. To do this, I made a round metal spatula and taped off the area along the contact lines between the spatula and the cove. The fillets were then injected with thickened epoxy, as explained before, out of a plastic bag. Afterwards, they were spread out and smoothed with a spatula. Any remaining excess was removed with the tape and another straight spatula. Once it was dry, I sanded the fillets by hand. After that, I cleaned everything and coated it with undiluted epoxy. Fiberglass strips were then laid on top and coated again with undiluted epoxy and finally covered with peeled ply, and of course again covered with undiluted epoxy. To install the stringers for stiffening the floor, the positions were first marked on the floor. These always have a nominal width of 12 centimeters, starting at the outer edge of the keelson. Everything was well cleaned and the wooden strips were coated on the underside. Thickened epoxy was then applied to the strips and the strips were placed in their respective positions. Were then weighted down as evenly as possible with various things. Piece by piece, the weights were removed again and any overflowing epoxy was scraped away with a spatula. Afterwards, everything was smoothed out by hand using a sanding block. At that time, I decided it was time to turn the hull over to create the recess for the centerboard. It weighs about 80 kilos, so 2 people can still carry it. By the way, thanks a lot for the help. So we lifted it onto the trailer and modified the rack so that the hull could lie upside down on it. To do this, a board was cut to match the curvature of the foredeck and screwed onto the longitudinal beams of the rack. At the rear, a wide beam was simply screwed across. The contact surfaces with the boat were coated with foam to prevent damage to the hull. Then, with 3 helpers, we lifted the hull of the trailer, turned it and placed it on the rack. And again, thanks a lot for the help, guys. Then I was able to start cutting out the recess for the centerboard. To do this, I first drilled a hole with a large drill bit that was just big enough for the flush cutter to fit through. To ensure a straight cut, I built a jig that was secured to the hull at the front and the back with straps. The long screwed-on pieces of wood connecting the ends provide a straight support for the router. Milling the recess was very easy this way. I just had to be careful not to go too far forward in the front area, since the centerboard folds exclusively backwards. I therefore stopped from time to time and fitted the centerboard in the recess to check for the correct length. The edge was then rounded with a 9mm radius without a jig. Afterwards, everything was sanded again by machine and by hand. As my foam roller doesn't fit in the recess for the centerboard, I had to use pre-wetted fiberglass to reinforce this area. I therefore cut strips of fiberglass, laid them onto a plastic bag and wetted them out with epoxy. I reinforced it with 2 layers of fiberglass. The smaller inner one with a width of about 3 centimeters covering the rounding, and the outer one with a width of about 10 centimeters covering the area around it. Finally, I applied peel ply to prevent epoxy from running down the inner side of the recess for the centerboard. And as always, to reduce the time of sanding. Finally, I sanded everything with the eccentric grinder and by hand. I hope you liked this video. Thanks for watching. Ciao!